On her graduation day, while the music from the ceremony still echoed faintly across the lawn, my granddaughter stood before me in her crisp cap and gown, phone in hand, a gleam of pride in her eyes that felt sharper than kindness. She looked at me as if I were a relic, a man who had long since been left behind by the modern world, and said, clear enough for the friends standing near us to hear, "You don't understand success, Grandpa." It wasn't shouted, it wasn't meant as an insult in her mind, and somehow that made it worse. It was the casual certainty of youth, the unshakable belief that wisdom only belongs to those who hold the newest tools, the latest trends, the loudest voices. Her friends exchanged knowing looks and half smiles, and she joined them, as though we all agreed. I smiled faintly, not because her words amused me, but because I'd heard them before. Not from her, but from others long ago. People who thought I was done, people who thought I'd missed my moment, people who thought they could erase me by rewriting the credits, by removing my name from what I had built. She didn't know, and how could she? I had never told her the full story. She didn't know that before she was born, I stood at the edge of an empty lot, staring up at the sky, imagining the tower that would rise there. She didn't know I had fought for every permit, every contract, every design change. She didn't know that my hands had shaken when I signed the final deal. Not out of fear, but out of pride. And she certainly didn't know that the shining tower dominating the city's skyline, the one she posted on her social media almost weekly, was mine. My vision, my money, my name, until the day it was stolen. I could have told her. I could have laid it all out right then, wiping the smug certainty off her face. But life had taught me something the world rarely remembers. You don't win by explaining yourself to those who have already decided you're not worth listening to. You wait. You let reality do the talking. You let the truth walk in when the time is right. Her version of success was measured in followers and likes, in photos that made strangers envious and friends competitive. My version was measured in permanence, in building something that outlasted the applause, the kind of success that doesn't fade when the algorithm changes, the kind that stands, night after night, lit against the dark, long after those who doubted you have moved on to doubt someone else. So I didn't defend myself. I didn't even flinch. I just nodded, as though I were agreeing with her, and let her believe the story she'd written in her head. Because I knew what she didn't. The day was coming when she'd stand at the base of that tower, look up, and see the truth carved into stone and glass. And in that moment, there would be no need for speeches. That day was coming sooner than she could possibly imagine. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Please write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened to you? And if you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. All right, let's continue. That night, long after the celebration had ended and the polite smiles had faded, I sat alone by the window in my study. The city stretched out before me, a living tapestry of glass, steel, and light. One by one, the buildings lit up as the sun bled into the horizon, and the streets began to hum with the quiet rhythm of evening. I used to love this view. It had once filled me with the kind of pride that is silent, steady, the pride of knowing you had left your fingerprints on the very bones of a place. But tonight, the view felt different. It was like watching someone you loved deeply, someone you once built a life with, and realizing they no longer recognize you. I could see the tower, my tower, glowing brighter than all the others, its mirrored windows catching the last traces of sunlight, turning them into fire. And yet, to the people who walked those streets, to my own family, it was just another landmark, another piece of the skyline. The truth of who had dreamed it into existence had been paved over, like an old road no one bothers to remember. I leaned back, my fingers tracing the edge of the armrest, remembering the smell of wet concrete the day the foundation was poured, the sound of hammers, the way the wind at that height cut into your lungs, sharp and clean. I remembered running my hand across the first steel beam before it was lifted into place, thinking that it would stand longer than I would, that it would carry my name long after I was gone. That had been my quiet promise to myself. But people forget. Deals get rewritten, names disappear from plaques. And time has a way of making even the loudest victories fade until they're just background noise in someone else's story. The worst part wasn't losing my place in the history of that building. The worst part was that my own granddaughter looked at me and saw nothing. Just an old man with outdated notions about what it means to succeed. I watched the tower's lights flicker on floor by floor, as if it were waking up for the night. And in that glow, I saw the years I had given to it. Years taken from my youth, my family, my health. I thought about the hands that had turned against me, the signatures that had cut me out, the polite letters thanking me for my contribution while erasing me from the future. They had taken my name from the stone, but not from the foundation. That part they could never touch. Outside, the city was alive with motion, unaware of the man sitting in the shadows, watching over it like a ghost in his own home. And maybe I was a ghost, a presence that existed only in memory, in whispers, in a few old photographs stored in a drawer no one opened anymore. I stayed there until the night was deep, until the tower became just another light in the distance. But in my chest, something small and stubborn still burned, because while they had forgotten, I had not, and I knew, whether it took months or years, the day would come when they would remember, not because I demanded it, but because the truth would be standing there in plain sight, impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, I noticed it more than ever, the distance that had been quietly growing between me and my own family. It wasn't just miles or years. It was something harder to measure, something you could feel in the pauses between words at the dinner table, in the way they asked polite questions, but didn't wait for the answers. My children, my grandchildren, they lived in a world that moved faster than memory, a world where the past was a quaint relic, like an old photograph you look at once before sliding it back into the drawer. For them, success was a picture that went viral, a deal that closed in the span of a phone call, a sudden wave of attention that burned bright and then vanished by morning. They measured life in moments that could be shared, replayed, and forgotten just as quickly. I understood why. The world had changed, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. When I was their age, success was quieter. It didn't arrive in a flash. It was something you built, brick by brick, year after year, until one day it stood before you, not because you'd announced it to the world, but because it simply could not be ignored. It was the kind of success that endured after the applause stopped, after the lights went out, after your name stopped appearing in the papers. That's what I had lived for. That's what I had given my life to. Sometimes when they all gathered in the living room, I would watch them from my chair as they scrolled through their glowing screens, laughing at something I couldn't see. I used to be at the center of their attention when they were younger, the storyteller, the one they came to with questions about life, about how things worked, about how to fix what was broken. Now, the glow they looked toward didn't come from me. It came from the tiny glass rectangles in their hands. I didn't resent them for it. Not exactly. It wasn't their fault they were born into a world that runs on speed and noise. But I couldn't help feeling invisible in my own bloodline. The stories of my life, the battles I had fought, the victories I had earned, they weren't just unimportant to them. They felt irrelevant, as if the world before the internet was not a world worth remembering. And yet, I knew something they didn't. All those quick wins, those flashes of attention, they were like fireworks, bright, loud, unforgettable for a moment, and then gone, leaving only smoke in the air. Real success wasn't a burst of light. It was the slow, steady fire that kept burning long after everyone else had gone home. I thought about telling them this, about sitting them down and explaining what it means to build something that lasts. But I didn't. They wouldn't hear it now. They weren't ready. Sometimes people have to run headlong into the emptiness before they can understand the value of something solid. So I stayed quiet. I listened to their laughter, their half-finished conversations, their endless scrolling, and I waited, because one day, whether they realized it or not, they would stand in the shadow of something I had built, and in that shadow they would finally see me. In the very heart of the city, there stands a tower that seems to catch the light no matter the hour. By day, it reflects the clouds and the endless movement below. By night, it glows like a beacon, its windows burning gold against the dark. From almost anywhere in the city, you can look up and see it, piercing the sky. People point to it in conversation. Tourists photograph it. Couples choose it as the backdrop for their wedding pictures. It is a symbol now, of ambition, of progress, of the city's pride, and yet no one in my family knows that it was mine. Not in the shallow sense of ownership that comes with a check written at the right moment, but in the way a creator knows the work of his own hands. I had imagined it when the space it occupies was nothing but a vacant lot overgrown with weeds and litter. I had stood on that bare ground and seen the lines of its steel frame before they were drawn, had pictured the light bouncing off its mirrored glass years before a single pane existed. Every inch of it had been a fight, a battle with investors, with city councils, with weather, with my own exhaustion. I wasn't just the architect on paper, I was the heartbeat that kept the project alive when others wanted to walk away. And when the financing faltered, I didn't cut my losses. I doubled down. I poured my savings, my time, my health into making sure that tower rose exactly as I had envisioned. It became the single most defining accomplishment of my working life. And then it was taken from me, not the structure itself. No one could ever erase my fingerprints from its foundation. But my name, the one engraved on the marble plaque in the lobby, was removed. It happened quietly, after a deal I had been cornered into making. The new owners claimed it was streamlining the brand, as if history were a matter of convenience. They replaced my name with theirs, as though they could inherit my vision simply by carving their letters into stone. The public forgot almost immediately. That's how the world works. People notice change for a moment, then move on. But the tower didn't forget. The lines, the angles, the proportions that made it beautiful, those were mine. No legal document could rewrite that truth. Sometimes when I'm in the city, I catch myself stopping at a street corner just to look at it. The glass catches the sunset in a way that feels like it's answering me, like it knows I'm there. It stands for everything I once believed in: endurance, precision, and the quiet satisfaction of creating something that will outlive you. But it's a strange kind of grief, too. My children walk past it without slowing down. My grandchildren see it only as part of the scenery. They don't know that the building they admire from afar is the same one that cost me sleepless nights, years of my life, and the last pieces of my trust in certain people. They don't know that when they take its picture, they are holding a piece of my soul in their hands. One day I think they will. One day the truth will rise just as high as the tower itself. And when that day comes, they'll understand that some legacies can be stolen from the record, but never from the skyline. It was over lunch a few weeks later, at a restaurant she had chosen because everyone goes there now, that the conversation returned to success. She spoke about it with the certainty of someone who believed she was defining the word for the first time in history. Between bites of salad and sips of sparkling water, she listed the names of people she admired, celebrities with millions of followers, bloggers whose lives looked like an endless vacation, billionaires who moved money with a flick of their fingers. Her voice carried that familiar spark, the one she reserved for things she believed were worth aspiring to. She didn't look at me much as she talked. I was across from her, nodding occasionally, watching the way her phone sat beside her plate like a second companion. Every so often it lit up, and she'd glance at it, her smile deepening, her thoughts momentarily leaving the table before she returned to her monologue about people she believed had made it. I realized then that it wasn't just that she didn't know my story. She didn't want to know it. Not because she was cruel, but because the world she lived in had no place for the kind of success I understood. To her, my past was an antique, something to acknowledge politely before moving on to shinier, newer things. In her eyes, I was a man with outdated views about life, someone who didn't grasp that the game had changed. As I listened, I could feel the distance stretching further between us. I thought about the men and women she named, about the speed at which their fame could crumble. I thought about the lives they projected online, the perfection, the beauty, the illusion of control. and how fragile it all was. I had seen empires fall. I had watched names that once dominated the skyline fade into obscurity, erased not by scandal, but by time itself. She would not have understood that the most valuable things I'd ever built were the ones no camera could capture. The tower was one of them, yes, but there were others. Relationships, principles, the discipline to keep working long after the spotlight moved elsewhere. The kind of things you couldn't post about because they were too deeply rooted in reality to be filtered into something pretty. There was a moment, as she laughed about a billionaire's latest acquisition, when I thought about interrupting her. I imagined telling her about the contracts I had fought for, the betrayals I had endured, the victories no one had celebrated but me. I thought about describing the day the tower's final beam was set in place, about the way the workers clapped each other on the back, not for show, but because we all knew what it had taken to get there. But I stayed quiet, not because her words didn't matter, but because I knew they wouldn't matter forever. The world she admired was built on shifting sand, and one day she would find herself searching for something solid. When that day came, I wanted her to remember that I hadn't lectured her or demanded respect. I had simply been here, steady, unmoved, a part of the landscape she thought she understood. She finished her story with a satisfied smile, as though she had just painted a picture of the future. I smiled back, knowing that the picture was incomplete, and one day she would see the missing piece, standing in the center of the city, tall enough to cast a shadow over everything she thought she knew. I still remember the day they took my name away. It was years ago, but the details are etched into my mind with the kind of clarity you wish you could forget. We had gathered in the boardroom, the same one where we had once shared coffee in paper cups and sketched the first outlines of the tower on the backs of napkins. The air that day felt different, heavier. My partners, men I had trusted, laughed with, argued with in the heat of deadlines, wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Their voices were measured, too controlled, as if they were reading from a script rehearsed in a room I hadn't been invited into. They told me it was for the good of the business, that the investors wanted a cleaner image, a fresh face for the brand. They said removing my name from the project would make it simpler to move forward. Simpler for them, they meant, not for me. They never said the word betrayal, but it hung in the air like smoke, impossible to miss. I didn't shout, I didn't pound the table or threaten to burn it all down. That's not who I was, and it's not who I wanted to be. I listened, I let them finish their carefully chosen words, and then I stood, adjusted my jacket, and walked out without looking back. But as I left, I took something with me, not the building, not the credit, but the truth. I had documents, contracts, original blueprints with my name printed in ink that no deal could erase. I had letters, receipts, photographs from the first days on site when the ground was still uneven and the skyline just a dream in our heads. I kept them all. Not out of spite, but out of instinct. I knew the world had a way of forgetting, and sometimes you have to hold on to proof, not because you need it now, but because one day someone will. In the months that followed, I watched from a distance as the tower climbed higher into the sky. I would catch glimpses of it through the windshield in traffic or framed between buildings as I walked downtown. It hurt, seeing it in the hands of men who had erased me from its story, but there was also a strange pride in knowing that they could never truly take it away. The lines of its design, the heart of its structure, those were mine. Even stripped of my name, it was still, in every way that mattered, my creation. Sometimes I would imagine going back, confronting them, demanding that the truth be set right. But I didn't, not because I didn't care, but because I believed time would have its say. The world changes, people move on, but certain truths have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them. I put the box of documents on a high shelf in my study, where it gathered dust for years. Every now and then, I would glance at it, knowing that inside was everything I needed to reclaim my place in the story if the moment ever came. And I believed, quietly but firmly, that it would. Because buildings aren't the only things that stand the test of time. Sometimes so does justice. The invitation didn't arrive in my mailbox. It never would have. Not from them. I heard about it by accident, in the kind of half-overheard conversation that makes you stop in your tracks. An old acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, that the tower was getting a full facade renovation. Fresh glass, new lighting design, a grand reopening event with speeches and cameras. It would be, he said, a reintroduction of the building to the city. A reintroduction, as though the city had forgotten it, as though they had built it anew, without the hands that had given it shape. I went home that night and sat in my study, staring at the skyline through the window. Even in the dark, the tower stood out, brighter than anything else around it. I imagined the banners they would hang, the music they would play, the self-congratulating speeches about innovation and vision. I imagined the applause for men who had bought their way into a legacy they hadn't earned. And for a moment, I felt the old wound stir again, raw and bitter. But then, something shifted. It wasn't anger this time. It was resolve. Quiet, steady, like the feeling you get before a long walk you know you have to take. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want an apology. What I wanted was to stand there on that day in the shadow of what I had built and see it with my own eyes. To be present when they polished the surface of a truth they could never fully hide. I pulled the box from the shelf, the one that had sat untouched for years, gathering dust like a sealed time capsule. I opened it slowly, as though the past might spill out all at once if I wasn't careful. Inside were the blueprints with my signature, the first sketches drawn in pencil, contracts with my name printed bold, photographs of me in a hard hat, shaking hands with the men who would later turn theirs against me. I spread them out on the desk, the paper yellowed at the edges, the ink still sharp. Every piece was a reminder that history doesn't vanish just because someone wants it to. I didn't tell anyone my plan. Not my children, not my granddaughter. This wasn't for them. Not yet. This was for me. I would go to that reopening not as a guest on their list, but as the man who had been there from the first shovel of dirt to the last bolt tightened. I would walk among the crowd, invisible to most, but knowing that every inch of that building had been born in my mind long before they claimed it. That night I stood at the window a little longer than usual. The tower gleamed in the distance, and for the first time in years I didn't just see what they had taken from me. I saw what I had given to the city. Something beautiful, something enduring. They could change the glass, the lights, the speeches, but they could not change the fact that it was mine. And soon I would stand beneath it again, not to demand recognition, not to make a scene, but to bear witness to the truth that no one could erase. The day of the reopening arrived with the kind of weather that makes a city look almost unreal. A sky so clear it seemed painted, sunlight pouring over glass and steel until everything shimmered. From the moment we stepped onto the crowded plaza, I could feel the hum of anticipation in the air. My granddaughter was beside me, dressed for photographs, her phone already in her hand, scanning for the best angles, the best light, the best backdrop. For her, this was a chance to be part of an event everyone online would be talking about by evening. For me, it was something else entirely. The tower stood before us in all its renewed perfection. The fresh glass so reflective, it seemed to capture the entire city in its surface. I could see the fine details where the panels met, the subtle changes in the structure that only someone who had lived through its birth would notice. Around us, people craned their necks, pointing upward, murmuring about how beautiful it was. It felt strange hearing them speak about it as if it had appeared from nothing, as if the years, the battles, the sacrifices that had brought it into being had never happened. The plaza was filled with rows of chairs for the invited guests, but I didn't take one. Instead, I drifted toward the side of the stage, close enough to see the podium and the stack of speech cards resting on it. My granddaughter barely noticed I'd moved. She was busy capturing herself in the golden reflection of the tower, turning her head just so, adjusting the fall of her hair. I wondered briefly if she had any idea how strange it was for me to stand here, so close to the celebration of something that had once been mine in name and still was in truth. I could feel the sun warm against my face, the kind of heat that carries a weight of memory. I remembered standing in almost the exact same spot decades earlier, wearing a hard hat, sweat running down my back as I looked up at the first completed floors. The sounds were different then, no music, no speeches, just the clang of tools and the deep hum of machinery. But the feeling was the same, the quiet awe of watching something rise from the ground that you had only ever seen in your mind. The crowd shifted as the music began to play, and the officials, investors, and public figures started making their way to the stage. They waved at the cameras, shook hands, posed for photographs that would fill the news feeds before the hour was over. My granddaughter glanced toward them briefly before turning her attention back to her phone. She didn't notice the way I was watching. Not them, but the building towering above all of us. Some part of me had expected to feel anger standing here, but instead, I felt something else. A deep, still sense of ownership. No matter whose names would be spoken into those microphones, no matter what narratives they spun, the truth remained untouched. This was my work, my vision, my legacy, and I had come here not to fight for it, but to stand with it. The speeches hadn't started yet, but the moment I had been waiting for was already taking shape. I could feel it, like the slow drawing in of breath before something is finally said aloud. I stayed where I was, near the edge of the stage, as close as I could be without crossing into the space reserved for those who had earned their places on paper. I didn't need a chair. I didn't need a name tag. I only needed to be here, close enough to touch the truth. When it finally broke through the noise, the music faded, and the host stepped up to the podium, the microphone crackling slightly as the sound carried across the plaza. The crowd quieted, shifting in their seats, cameras lifting in unison. I stood still at the side of the stage, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, the sunlight glancing off the tower's surface and into my eyes. His voice was practiced, the kind you hear at ceremonies, polished, steady, meant to inspire. He began by speaking about the renovation, about the beauty of the new glass, the upgraded lighting, the importance of the tower to the city's image. The crowd murmured in agreement, applauding at the right moments. My granddaughter took a few more photos, still unaware of the undercurrent building and the words being spoken. And then his tone shifted. He paused, letting the silence stretch just enough for everyone to feel it. His eyes swept the crowd as if searching for someone. "But today," he said slowly, "we are not only unveiling a renewed building, we are also restoring something far more important: historical justice." The phrase landed in the air like a bell tolling. I could feel the faint stir of attention from those around me, the curiosity pricking at the edges of the crowd. "This tower," he continued, "was born not just from steel, glass, and money, but from vision, from a mind that saw it before it stood here, from hands that fought for it when it was only an idea. And for too long, that name has not been where it belongs." Something in my chest tightened. My eyes stayed fixed on the stage, but my breath slowed, as if my body already knew what was about to happen. "This tower," the host said, his voice lifting, "bears the name of its true creator, and today we put that name back where it belongs." The giant screen behind him flickered, the image changing from a live feed of the stage to bold white letters stretching across a deep black background. My name, my full name. Letters I had not seen connected to this building in decades, now blazing 20 feet high for the entire city to see. For a moment, the sound around me dissolved. I didn't hear the applause right away, though it was there, rising, swelling, rolling over the plaza. I didn't see the cameras flash, though the light was everywhere. All I saw was my name, filling the screen the way it had once filled the marble in the lobby, before it had been chiseled away. I felt an odd stillness, not triumph exactly, but something purer. A deep, unshakable affirmation that no amount of time, no betrayal, no deal signed in haste could erase what had been true from the beginning. My name had come home. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my granddaughter's phone lower slowly. Her gaze had left the screen. She was looking at me now, not with the casual glance of someone humoring an old man, but with eyes wide, searching, almost disbelieving. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The truth had spoken for me. The applause continued, but it felt far away. All I heard was the quiet inside my own head, the sound of something being set right, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to breathe fully, as if a weight I had been carrying so long I'd forgotten its presence had finally been lifted. My name was no longer just in the papers I kept on a shelf. It was alive again, etched not just into the tower, but into the city's memory, where it should have been all along. For a long moment after my name appeared on that towering screen, the plaza seemed to hold its breath. Even the applause, though loud, felt muted to me, as if the world had been wrapped in glass, and sound could no longer reach me in the same way. But then I felt it. Not the eyes of the crowd, not the flash of the cameras, hers. My granddaughter had stopped mid-motion, her phone frozen halfway between her lap and her face. She didn't take another picture. She didn't even seem to realize she was holding it. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she turned toward me. The easy confidence she always carried, the unshakable self-assurance I had seen so many times before, had slipped from her face. What replaced it was harder to name. There was shock, certainly, the wide eyes of someone seeing a truth that doesn't fit into the story they've always believed. There was confusion, too, the kind that makes you instinctively search for some other explanation, even when you know there isn't one. But layered beneath those, like a shadow just visible in the light, was something else, respect and something close to guilt. It was in the way her gaze lingered on me, searching my face as though she might find the missing pieces of the puzzle she'd never tried to put together before. I didn't look away. I let her see me, not as the quiet, outdated man she thought she knew, but as the one who had stood on empty ground and imagined a tower where there was nothing, and then fought to make it real. Around us, the noise swelled again. People clapped, some stood. The announcer's voice carried on with words about legacy and vision. But between us, there was only silence, a charged, fragile silence that seemed to connect this moment to everyone before it. Every time she had looked past me, every time I had held my tongue, every time she had spoken about real success, without realizing she was speaking to it. I could see her lips part, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. And I didn't need them, because what I saw in her eyes now told me more than anything she could have said. The disbelief was already giving way to understanding, and with it came a dawning awareness that there was far more to my story than she had ever imagined. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply stood there, letting her see me, letting the truth settle in her mind without rushing it. The moment was too rare, too important to disturb with words. She turned back toward the screen once more, my name still glowing against the tower's reflection, and I knew she would never look at it the same way again. The city had reclaimed its history, but she had just begun to reclaim the part of her own family she never knew she'd lost. The applause swelled like a tide, rolling over the plaza in waves. People rose from their chairs, clapping harder now, some even cheering. I saw strangers in the crowd turning to each other, as if confirming they'd heard the name right, as if they were piecing together fragments of a story they had never known. And then they began to move toward me. It started with one man. Suit, tie, the polished smile of someone used to shaking important hands. He extended his, and I took it, feeling the warmth of a grip that meant more than the words he spoke. Then another came, a woman I didn't recognize, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that comes from standing near something you've just learned is part of history. A few spoke my name aloud, tasting it, perhaps, for the first time. Some just nodded deeply, as if we shared a private understanding. I accepted each handshake, each nod, but I didn't beam with pride or bask in the recognition. My face stayed calm, my voice low when I thanked them. Because this wasn't triumph. It wasn't about being celebrated. It was about something quieter, something deeper. This was the truth returning to where it belonged, and I was simply there to witness it. For years, I had carried the knowledge of what I'd built like a stone in my pocket. Always with me, invisible to others, heavy but familiar. I had never expected the world to hand me back my place in its memory. And yet, here it was, laid before me in a moment so public it felt almost intimate, because the meaning of it lived entirely in my own chest. The tower loomed above us, its windows catching the light, the letters of my name etched in the announcement behind the stage like they had never been gone. I glanced up at it, and for a heartbeat I didn't see the crowd, or the banners, or the polished facade they had dressed it in. I saw the skeletal frame as it had been in the early days, raw steel reaching into a gray sky, rain streaking down the beams, the sound of hammers and voices calling to one another over the wind. I saw the workers whose names would never be spoken here. The plans spread across my desk late into the night, the fights in cramped offices over every small detail. The applause kept going, but it felt far away now. My focus wasn't on the noise or the people still stepping forward to take my hand. It was on the stillness inside me, the quiet affirmation that what I had done had endured, even when my name hadn't. And maybe that was why I couldn't bring myself to smile like a man receiving a prize. This wasn't a prize, it was balance restored. My granddaughter was still beside me, watching the scene unfold with a mix of awe and something more complicated. I could feel her eyes on me, searching, perhaps, for some outward sign of triumph. But I had no need for it. I had already learned long ago that the most important victories aren't the ones you celebrate with champagne. They're the ones that settle, deep and unshakable, in the part of you that no one can touch. And in that moment, as the clapping began to fade, I knew this was one of them. When the last of the applause thinned and the hum of voices softened into the background, I felt a shift beside me. No words, no announcement, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet presence drawing closer. My granddaughter stepped in until her shoulder brushed against mine, and then, without looking at me directly, she slipped her hand through the crook of my arm. It was such a small thing, so simple that no one else around us even noticed. But to me, it was a moment as sharp and clear as sunlight through glass. She had been standing apart all morning, absorbed in her own reasons for being here. Moving through the crowd like this was just another event in a city that never stopped hosting them. Now she stood still, with me. She didn't speak, and I didn't turn to her. Words would have been too fragile for this moment, too easy to misunderstand. Language has a way of getting tangled in pride, in explanations, in the need to defend or justify. This, her hand resting lightly on my arm, cut past all of that. It was not an apology wrapped in careful phrasing. It was something truer. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you see someone not for who you've assumed they are, but for what they've carried, what they've built, what they've endured in silence. I could feel it in the way her fingers stayed there, steady, unhurried, like she was anchoring herself to something she had almost lost without realizing it. Around us, the ceremony continued. More speeches, more smiles for the cameras. But we were no longer part of the noise. We were in our own quiet pocket of space where time slowed just enough for her to bridge the distance I'd been feeling for years. She didn't need to tell me she was proud. She didn't need to confess that she'd been wrong. I could feel it in her stillness, in the weight of that silent grip. It struck me then how many years I had waited for this. Not the public moment, not the return of my name to the tower, but this private acknowledgement, the kind that can only come from someone whose respect matters in a way no applause ever could. I kept my gaze fixed on the building rising above us, its windows catching the light, my name once again a part of its story. But beneath that, I was aware of her in a way I hadn't been in a long time, aware of the space she now chose to stand in, the fact that she had closed the gap not because I had asked, but because she had decided it was where she belonged. And in that still unspoken moment, I knew that something far more important than a plaque or a title had been restored. That evening, after the plaza had emptied, and the last of the golden light had drained from the streets, she came to me. There was no ceremony now, no cameras, no crowd. Just the two of us in my quiet study, the city murmuring faintly beyond the window. She stood there for a moment, almost hesitant, and then said the simplest words, the ones I had never expected to hear from her. "Tell me how it began." It caught me off guard. For years, she had been politely uninterested in the past, quick to change the subject when stories turned to the old days. But now there was something in her voice, not just curiosity, but a hunger to understand. I gestured toward the armchair by my desk, and she sat, her posture leaning slightly forward the way you do when you don't want to miss a single word. I pulled the box from the shelf, the same one I had opened before the reopening. its edges worn smooth with time. I set it on the desk between us and lifted the lid. The smell of old paper rose, faint but distinct, like the ghost of a chapter that had been shut away for too long. One by one, I laid the contents before her. The original blueprints, edges frayed, my name written in ink along the bottom corner. Letters from city officials approving the early plans. A photograph of me, younger and leaner, wearing a hard hat and squinting against the wind as the first steel beams reached into the sky. Images of the foundation being poured, of workers in safety vests clapping each other on the back after a long day. I began to speak, and for the first time in years, my voice carried the weight of those memories without hesitation. I told her about the battles no one saw, the meetings where funding almost fell through, the nights I went home unsure if the project would survive another week. I spoke about the thrill of watching the first floor take shape, the fear that came with every setback, and the quiet determination that kept me coming back even when my partners had already started planning their exits. She didn't interrupt. She didn't glance at her phone. She watched my hands as they hovered over each piece of paper, her eyes moving from the documents to my face, as if stitching together a picture she'd never known was missing. There were moments when I could see emotion flicker across her expression. Surprise, respect, and something almost like sorrow for not having asked sooner. Hours passed without either of us noticing. The tower's lights burned far in the distance, visible from the window, and I realized how strange it was to sit here, telling its story while it still stood there, alive in the skyline. It felt like introducing her not just to a building, but to a piece of me she had never met before. When I finished, the desk was covered in history, my history, spread out like a map of the years I had lived for something bigger than myself. She sat quietly, her gaze drifting over the papers, her fingertips resting lightly on one of the old photographs as if touching it might somehow pull her closer to the moment it captured. In her silence, I felt something shift. She wasn't just hearing me, she was seeing me, and that more than anything was what I had been waiting for. In the days that followed, I noticed something in her that hadn't been there before. It was subtle at first, a quietness, a kind of thoughtfulness in the way she carried herself. She still moved through the world with the energy of youth, still laughed easily and spoke quickly, but now there was a depth in her gaze when it met mine, a recognition that hadn't been there the week before. We didn't speak about the reopening directly again. We didn't have to. But I began to see the signs of what had shifted in her. The names of celebrities and influencers that once peppered her conversations appeared less often, replaced by questions that dug deeper. She started asking me about the people I had worked with, the choices I'd made, the things that had nearly broken the project, and the moments that had saved it. One evening I caught her standing by the window, looking out at the skyline. The tower was visible in the distance, lit in gold, steady against the dark. She didn't take a picture. She didn't even reach for her phone. She just stood there, arms folded loosely, her expression calm in a way I hadn't seen before. I realized then that her definition of success had changed. It was no longer about being the loudest name in the room or gathering the most attention in the shortest time. She understood now that real success was in building something that would outlast you, something that could stand when you were gone, carrying your vision forward without needing you to constantly defend it. And more than that, she had begun to see the power in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of the patience to let time prove what words cannot. She had watched me stand in that plaza without boasting, without reminding anyone of what they owed me, and she had seen the truth arrive on its own. She understood now that sometimes the greatest strength is not in shouting your worth, but in knowing it so completely that you don't have to. I could see it in the way she looked at me when we spoke, the way her questions lingered, the way she listened without rushing to fill the space. She had started to measure value not in the noise something made, but in what remained when the noise faded. And though she never said it outright, I knew she had begun to carry that lesson into her own life. Because when you learn what truly lasts, the rest begins to feel smaller, less urgent, and that kind of understanding changes you in ways you can't easily put into words, but you can see it as clearly as a tower that still stands after the years have tried to wear it down. A month later, we went back to the tower. The city was different that day, the air heavy with the scent of rain that had passed an hour before, the streets glistening, the reflections of buildings stretching long and thin in the puddles. The sky was clearing, the kind of pale blue that makes glass shine like water. We walked without hurry, side by side, our footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement. When we turned the last corner and the tower came into view, it was as if it had been waiting for us. The sunlight struck its new glass in sharp angles, casting patterns across the plaza. The air was quieter than on the day of the reopening. No crowd, no speeches, just the steady hum of the city and the slow rhythm of people passing by. We stopped at the base of the building in front of the stone where the new plaque had been placed. My name was there, bold, clean, unshadowed by the years it had been absent. The letters were cut deep, their edges catching the light as if the stone itself wanted to make sure no one could miss them again. She stood in front of it for a long time, not moving, not speaking. I didn't rush her. I let her take it in, let the truth sit in the silence between us. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint sounds of the city, a bus braking somewhere down the block, the clink of cutlery from a nearby cafe, and I realized how strange it was that such an ordinary day could hold a moment like this. Finally, she turned to me. There was no hesitation in her eyes now, no confusion, no guardedness, just a steady, almost reverent sincerity. "Grandpa," she said, her voice low but clear, "you understand success better than anyone." For a moment I didn't answer. I simply looked at her, the way you look at something you've waited a lifetime to see. And then I smiled. Not the kind of smile people give for cameras, not the quick reflex of courtesy, but the slow, quiet smile that comes when something inside you finally settles. Because I knew the truth. Success wasn't the tower itself. It wasn't even my name on the stone. Success was this, standing here, years after the dust of betrayal had settled, with the truth not just restored, but living on in someone who would carry it forward. The real victory was not in reclaiming my place in the city's memory, but in knowing it would not be lost again. The truth had returned, and it was anchored now, not only in steel and stone, but in the mind and heart of the person beside me. We stayed there a while longer, neither of us needing to speak. The tower rose above us, unshaken, a part of the skyline that would stand long after both of us were gone. And as we finally turned to leave, I felt no urge to look back. I didn't have to. Some things, once they've come home, never leave again,